I didn't leave because I wanted to run away, that I left because staying had started to feel like disappearing. My name is Ethan Carter, and for 8 years I had shared an apartment, a routine, and a quiet disappointment with Daniel Moore. We still spoke kindly to each other. We still slept in the same bed. But kindness, I learned, can become another form of distance when it replaces honesty. Daniel worked late. I learned not to ask questions that would slow him down. Somewhere between shared dinners and separate silences, I stopped feeling chosen. When the message from Lucas Reed appeared on my phone, it felt accidental, like something meant for a version of me that no longer existed. Lucas and I had known each other briefly years ago, never closely enough to matter, never distantly enough to forget. He wrote simply, "If you need space, I have a cabin." No questions. Just quiet that I didn't tell Daniel the full truth. I said I needed time to think, which was true in the way half-confessions often are. He nodded without looking up, as if he had already adjusted to my absence. That hurt more than an argument would have. The cabin sat deep in the woods, far from cell towers and expectations. Lucas met me at the edge of a narrow gravel road, standing beside an old truck that looked as tired as I felt. He was taller than I remembered, lean, his expression guarded but not unkind. He didn't hug me. He didn't ask why I was there. He just took my bag and said, "You can stay as long as you need." Inside, the cabin was simple: wooden walls, a small fireplace, shelves filled with books that had clearly been read more than once. It wasn't comfort that struck me, but intention. This was a place designed to keep the outside world from asking too many questions. That first evening passed quietly. We cooked together without touching, shared a meal without distraction, and spoke only when words felt necessary. Lucas moved through the space like someone used to being alone. I noticed how careful he was, how measured every gesture seemed, as if the cabin required respect rather than occupancy. Later, as the fire settled into embers, Lucas finally spoke with purpose. "There's one thing you should know before you decide to stay." I looked up, already bracing myself. "This place," he said, choosing his words with precision, "has rules. Only one that matters, really." He met my eyes then, fully, without flinching. "Whatever happens here, we don't cross that line." I didn't ask what line he meant. I didn't need to. The weight of the rule filled the space between us, heavy with implication. It wasn't about physical boundaries alone. It was about intention. About feelings that, once acknowledged, refused to stay contained. "I understand," I said, even though part of me already knew that understanding wouldn't make it easy. Lucas nodded, as if relieved, and stood to clear the table. The conversation ended there, but the rule did not. It followed me to the small bedroom at the back of the cabin, where I lay awake listening to the forest breathe around me. I thought about Daniel, how I used to fall asleep waiting for his hand to find mine, how lately it never did. I thought about Lucas, how he had offered shelter without curiosity, safety without promise. And I thought about the rule, how strange it was to forbid something that hadn't even happened, or maybe had already begun. As the wind moved through the trees, I realized the cabin wasn't just hidden from the world. It was hidden from consequences. And that made it dangerous in a way I wasn't sure I was ready to face. I closed my eyes, telling myself that I was here to think, not to feel, but the quiet didn't erase anything. It only made the truth louder. Morning arrived quietly, filtered through tall pines and thin curtains. The cabin woke slowly, as if it preferred restraint over urgency. Ethan rose before Lucas, standing by the window with a mug of coffee warming his hands, watching mist lift from the ground like something undecided about leaving. The days that followed found a rhythm that felt natural too quickly. They split small tasks without discussion, Lucas chopping wood, Ethan cooking simple meals. Conversation came in measured pieces, never forced, never empty. It was in those pauses, in the shared silences, that something unfamiliar began to take shape. Ethan noticed how Lucas listened, not just to words, but to what sat behind them. It made him careful in a way he hadn't been in years. One afternoon, as rain tapped steadily against the roof, Lucas spoke about his past. He didn't give details, only impressions, relationships that ended before they could begin, choices made out of caution rather than courage. I'm good at building walls, he admitted, staring into the fire. Even when I don't want to be. Ethan understood that language more than he wanted to admit. At night, when the cabin settled into darkness, Ethan checked his phone out of habit more than hope. Messages from Daniel were brief, practical. Did you get there safe? Let me know when you're back. There was no curiosity about how Ethan felt, no urgency in his absence. Each message landed with a dull weight, confirming what Ethan had been avoiding: distance doesn't always arrive suddenly. Sometimes it grows quietly, like a room you stop entering. Back in the cabin, Lucas never asked about Daniel. That absence of inquiry felt generous and dangerous at the same time. It allowed Ethan to exist without labels, without explanation. But it also allowed thoughts he should have questioned to settle comfortably in his mind. The rule hovered between them, unspoken but present. It shaped how close they stood, how long their eyes met. Yet with each passing day, Ethan became aware of how often he noticed Lucas, how his voice softened when he laughed, how his focus sharpened when Ethan spoke. None of it crossed a boundary, and yet it all pressed against one point. One evening, as the storm returned with more force than before, the power cut out without warning. The cabin fell into darkness, lit only by a single candle Lucas placed on the table. Shadows stretched across the walls, blurring edges and intentions. Looks like we're stuck, Lucas said lightly, though his voice carried tension. They sat closer than usual, not touching, but aware of the space narrowing between them. The candle flickered, and for a moment Ethan felt the urge to say something reckless, something honest. He didn't. He thought of Daniel. He thought of the rule. This is where it gets complicated, Lucas said quietly, as if responding to the thought itself. People think boundaries are about control. But most of the time, they're about fear. Ethan looked at him then, really looked, and saw not restraint but uncertainty. Fear of what? He asked. Lucas didn't answer right away. Fear of wanting something that costs too much. The words settled heavily. Ethan felt the truth of them land somewhere uncomfortably close to home. Wanting had always been the dangerous part, not the act, but the admission. That night, Ethan dreamed of rooms without doors, of voices he couldn't quite place. When he woke, the storm had passed, leaving the air sharp and clean. Lucas was already outside, clearing debris from the path. He looked up as Ethan stepped out, their eyes meeting briefly before Lucas looked away. The shift was subtle, but unmistakable. Something had been acknowledged, even if not named. The cabin felt smaller, its quiet more charged. Ethan realized then that the rule was no longer a line drawn in advance. That it was a test, and with each moment of restraint, each unspoken thought, Ethan felt himself moving closer to a decision he hadn't yet allowed himself to make. The morning after the storm felt different, as if the forest itself were holding its breath. Ethan sensed it the moment he stepped outside. The quiet was sharper, more attentive. Lucas stood near the edge of the clearing, his back turned, staring into the trees as though they might offer answers the cabin could not. Neither of them spoke at first. Words had grown heavier over the past day, each one carrying the risk of collapse. Ethan understood now that silence was no longer neutral. It was a choice, and one that was beginning to feel dishonest. I'm leaving today, Ethan said finally. Lucas turned, surprise flashing briefly across his face before it settled into something more controlled. You don't have to, he replied, though there was no insistence in his voice. I think I do, Ethan said. Staying feels like pretending I don't know what's happening. The truth sat between them, uninvited but undeniable. Whatever the rule had been meant to prevent, it had already failed. No touch had crossed a boundary, but something else had, something quieter and more difficult to undo. Lucas nodded slowly. That's why I made the rule, he said. Not because I don't feel it. Because I do. The admission landed with unexpected force. Ethan felt a tightening in his chest, a mixture of relief and grief. Knowing he wasn't alone in what he felt made it harder, not easier. Wanting, he realized, wasn't a fleeting emotion. It was a responsibility. I'm still with Daniel, Ethan said, the words sounding more real aloud. And even if nothing happened here, something changed. Lucas stepped back, creating space where closeness had been growing. "Then you should go back," he said quietly. "And decide who you want to be when no one's hiding." They packed in silence. The cabin, once a refuge, now felt like a mirror, reflecting choices Ethan could no longer avoid. When he reached the door, he hesitated, turning to Lucas one last time. "This mattered," Ethan said. "Even if it ends here." Lucas met his gaze, steady but unguarded. "Sometimes that's the point." The drive back felt longer than the journey in. With every mile, Ethan replayed moments he hadn't allowed himself to name, the ease of conversation, the pull of being truly seen. None of it had been imagined. And none of it could be taken lightly. Daniel was home when Ethan returned. He looked up from the couch, surprised, then smiled out of habit. "You're back earlier than I thought." "We need to talk," Ethan said. They sat across from each other, the familiar distance now impossible to ignore. Ethan didn't speak about Lucas in detail. He didn't need to. He spoke about absence, about loneliness, about realizing that staying had become another way of leaving. Daniel listened, quieter than Ethan expected. When the conversation ended, there were no raised voices, no dramatic gestures, just a shared understanding that something essential had already been lost. Later, alone in the bedroom that no longer felt like his, Ethan reflected on the cabin, on the rule, on how close he had come to crossing a line he once believed was clear. He understood now that infidelity isn't always marked by touch or secrecy. Sometimes it begins the moment you stop being honest, with yourself first, and then with everyone else. Before sleep claimed him, Ethan sent a short message to Lucas that I made my choice. It wasn't easy. "Thank you for not letting me pretend." The reply came hours later. That's the only rule that ever mattered. Ethan set the phone down, feeling the weight of consequence settle into something quieter, acceptance. The cabin would remain hidden, the rule unbroken in the way that mattered most. And though the path ahead was uncertain, it was finally his to walk without illusion. Some lines, Ethan realized, aren't crossed by desire, that they're crossed by denial. Time did not rush to fix anything. Ethan learned that quickly. Days passed with the steady indifference of routine, and yet each one carried a different weight. The apartment he once shared with Daniel was quieter now, not in the temporary way of absence, but in the lasting way of endings. Objects remained where they had always been, but meaning had shifted, leaving behind a hollow familiarity. Ethan moved out without drama. There were no arguments over furniture, no attempts to rewrite the past. Daniel helped him pack, careful and composed, as if they were closing a chapter neither of them had the strength to reread. When they said goodbye, it was with the kind of tenderness that arrives too late to be useful. Ethan understood then that love does not disappear all at once. It fades unevenly, leaving traces that linger long after decisions are made. That he found a small place on the other side of the city, modest and undecorated. At night, the silence pressed in, but it no longer felt threatening. It felt honest. Ethan began to recognize how rarely he had allowed himself to sit with discomfort without trying to escape it. The cabin had given him space, but distance alone had never been the solution. What mattered was what he did once the quiet followed him home. Lucas did not call. Ethan hadn't expected him to. Their last exchange had been complete in a way that didn't require continuation. Still, some evenings, Ethan caught himself replaying the sound of Lucas's voice, not with longing, but with clarity. It reminded him of the version of himself he had almost ignored, the one capable of choosing truth even when it came at a cost. Weeks later, Ethan returned to the woods, not to the cabin, but to the edge of the trail where it all began. He didn't go looking for Lucas. He went to remind himself that the place existed, and that it no longer owned any part of him. Standing there, surrounded by the steady patience of trees, he felt a quiet gratitude for a rule that had not been broken in the way that mattered most. Infidelity, Ethan realized, was never just about betrayal of another person. It was about the slow erosion of self-awareness, the moments when silence replaces courage. The cabin had not been a mistake. Avoiding the truth for so long had been. As he turned back toward the road, Ethan felt something close to peace, not the kind that erases complexity, but the kind that allows it. He didn't know whether he would ever see Lucas again. He didn't know what shape love would take next. But he knew this: he would not hide from himself again. That night, alone in his new apartment, Ethan opened a window and let the city sounds drift in. Life continued, imperfect and unresolved, but undeniably present. He thought of the rule one last time, not as a restriction, but as a reminder: some boundaries exist not to deny desire, but to reveal who we become when desire is tested. And for the first time in a long while, Ethan felt ready to find out.